To it. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Yaron Brook Show. And this is particularly exciting because we're doing this episode live from OCON. This is the first day of OCON. We've got a live audience here of, I don't know, 30 people or so. So it's always more fun to do these things with a live audience. I'll be taking questions from the live audience. I cannot get YouTube to work, so I can't get the super chat. So I won't be taking questions in super chat, which is too bad because I get money that way. Hey, Raka Ali is streaming me on his iPhone or something. I don't know what he's doing. But he's here in the audience, so thanks for joining us. We got people walking in or walking out, so you'll have to excuse some of the distractions, you guys online. So today's the first day of OCON, which is Objectivist Conferences. This is a conference we hold once a year in different places around the United States. This year it's in beautiful, sunny Southern California. It's in Newport Beach, which is not far from where I used to live, where I still have a home. So it's a place, right? I mean, I don't know if you guys been around, driven around, gone to the mall across the street, but it's fantastic, right? As long as you don't have to pay taxes here. It's unbelievable, right? Because state taxes, if you're in the top bracket, it's 13%, income tax rate, and that's brutal, particularly in comparison to my new home in Puerto Rico. So this morning, I was the first general session talk. Harry Binswanger gave a talk. I know Lisa Van Dam gave a talk. There were some other talks in breakout sessions. But my talk was the first, and I talked about being a rational optimist or being optimistic about the future, but doing it hopefully not in a Pollyannish, detached from reality way, but really in a grounded, factual, what is actually in reality. And there's a bunch of stuff I didn't say in the talk because I don't have it written down and didn't occur to me. But it was in my notes and it was so I thought I'd talk a little bit about that, a little bit flesh out the issue of what is optimism and how to think about it. Because how do you corroborate optimism with being realistic and being objective, and how do those go together? Which I didn't really discuss during the thing. And then I thought I'd take a few questions in the audience, and then we'll see where it takes us. I might be tempted to respond to Joe Rogan's comments on objectivism, which are always, I wouldn't even call them comments, as dismissal of us mean objectivists, right? So we might talk about meanness and objectivism. That might be a good topic. Maybe we can send a link to Joe Rogan and encourage him to have me on the show. So what does it mean to be optimistic? So it's an idea. It's the idea of having a level of confidence about the future, that the future is going to be good. That a perspective on the future. Yeah. All these guys are getting up and letting people sit. I didn't think objectivists did that. Right? So it's great. One of the great things about OCON, just as an aside, one of the great things about OCON is what a benevolent space this is. What a fun space. All these fun, nice, normal, or super normal, not really normal, like really cool people. Normal in the positive sense, not in the conforming sense. But benevolent and friendly and nice and happy and it's great. And a bunch of people who all share values, who all are kind of consistently on the same, at least mostly on the same page philosophically. So you don't have to guard yourself. You don't have to think, what am I saying? These people are going to jump on me. They, right or left or whatever. They're going to come after me. Everybody here basically agrees. Yeah, we've got our disagreements, even in my talk you saw, but it's such a benevolent place, which is what's always attracted me to OCON. Anyway, optimism. So how do you think about the future? And the first thing to recognize about the future, and I think this really sets the framework, is we don't know. You cannot have certainty, particularly about the future. There is no certainty. We're not deterministic animals where we know exactly what's going to happen. Given that human beings have free will, given that there are 8 billion of us on the planet, and we all could do completely unpredictable things, things that you can't imagine, good things and bad things. So that the future is, any way you think about it, at the end of the day, the future is probabilistic. You can say, I think this is likely, or I think there's a high probability this will happen. But you cannot have certainty about the future. Now, you can say, if nothing changes and this is certain to happen, because there is a deterministic element. Bad ideas do lead to bad outcomes. But there are so many variables involved in estimating what will happen in the future that I don't think you can actually take an absolutist certainty stand with regard to what's going to happen, even tomorrow. What's Donald Trump going to do tomorrow? I don't think he knows, never mind anybody from the outside being able to tell. So as long as we have free will in the equation, the future is probabilistic. And how you weight the different elements, how you weight the different facts, the different ideas, the different possibilities of what's going to happen is going to really determine whether you're confident, whether you have a positive view of the future or a negative view of the future. And I think a lot of that is going to depend on what your assessment is of the present. If your assessment of the present is pretty bleak, which I can understand, as I said in my talk, I can understand having a bleak assessment of the world in which we live, then it's going to be very hard to project a positive into the future. But if you can separate out in the present, objectively, right, objectively, what is good, what is bad, and what is getting better and what is getting worse. Where are the good things and where are the bad things happening? And what is more influential and what is less influential? And if you can anchor yourself with a good assessment of the present, of the now, of what's happening today, then I think you could start projecting into the future. You start projecting trends, you could start projecting ideas into the future. And this is why I think it's so important to really be objective about the world we live in now. We tend to overweight the negative. We all tend to overweight the negative. And it's really hard not to overweight the negative because everybody around us overweights the negative. Everywhere we go, we're bombarded with negativity. And then add to that a philosophy that is different, right? That is radical, that questions everything, that doubts everything, that is opposed to everything that's going on, from individual relationships to politics to what's going on in universities to everything, to what's going on in the art world, everything we're in a position. It's so easy to be negative because nobody is like us, right? Which just pisses us off, as it should. Right? They should all be like us. So it's difficult then to unwind everything and this is why I think history is so important. So we got the future. To understand the future, I'm saying you have to have an objective view of the present. But to understand, to have an objective view of the present, you have to know something about the past. You have to know something about where we've come from. And what are the trends? What are the big trends? And one of the things that I was thinking of that's truly astounding, because I read Enlightenment Now by Steven Pinker, which is, as I said in the talk, a fascinating read, and I think everybody should really read it. I think it should be required reading. But one of the things I was thinking of, all these trends are positive, but couldn't you say the same thing at 1913? And yet in the next few decades, you have 2 world wars, millions and millions of people are going to die, and civilization is just going to crumble. And yes, that is certainly possible. But you know what then struck me is, just on a blank slate, if you just started from scratch and you said, we're in 1913, we're going to have this devastating wars, everything's going to collapse, and out of those wars, we're going to have communism dominating 1/3 of the world, I'd think that's it. We're in the dark ages. It's a complete and utter disaster. How can you recover? How does anybody recover from something like that? I mean, think about the scale of devastation in World War II, and we've got a few Europeans here, and you don't see that in Europe today, right? I mean, Europe's recovered. It's thriving. Could be a lot better, and you could say all that, but life's pretty good for a European today. It's not that bad. Fairly rich, fairly safe. Everything's everybody's escaped. The reason I have mass migration is everybody wants to be in Europe because Europe's pretty good. So we managed to recover from these things. So yeah, they're devastating and millions of people have died and they didn't recover, right? But civilization recovered. And you have to ask, now part of that is the US. Part of that is the fact that America is a beacon of freedom and a beacon of knowledge and a beacon of everything good, and people could still use that as a place to gain values. And of course, the US economy was still churning along so they could invest and fund much of the recovery around the world. But it's not just the fact that the US is there. It's this accumulation of knowledge and wealth is very difficult to go away. It's very difficult to destroy everything that we know. And one of the points, again, I didn't make in my talk, but I meant to, is I mentioned that we've got all this that everybody goes to school all over the world now. They're learning math and science, and they're learning things. Everybody has a computer. Everybody has an iPad. That's very difficult to undo. The knowledge is very difficult to undo. So think about, people always say, we're like Rome. We're in the last days of Rome, and we're going to the Dark Ages. We're just about to hit, I used to say, fall off the cliff, and we're heading towards the Dark Ages, right? And I remember telling the story, I don't know if you know the story of Rome, but Rome at its peak had over 1 million people in the city of Rome. And I think within like 200 years, Rome had a population of 10,000. They were gone. They were gone. They went back to subsistence farming, and the population shrunk because people died, and they weren't replaced. And the technology was lost, and knowledge was lost. So you go to Pompeii, and there's running water in pipes and faucets. And within 200 years, that technology is gone. Europeans don't know how to do pipes. They used to have 4 or 5 story homes. Europeans lost the ability to do homes. The Colosseum in Rome. It took until well into the Renaissance that anybody could build anything like that again, right? All that knowledge was lost. And that's why it's really the Dark Ages. Knowledge was destroyed. But how many people had the knowledge when Rome was at its peak? How dispersed was that? It wasn't very. There was an elite that had the knowledge, and most people couldn't read, write, had nothing, didn't know math, didn't know anything. It was a very small group that held on to the knowledge that kept civilization going. And if you destroyed that group, if that group went away, if that group became Christian, which is the equivalent of going away, then the knowledge was lost. It was gone, finished, right? But think about who has the knowledge today. It's millions and millions and millions of people. Think about how many programmers there are today. Think about how many engineers there are today, all over the world, everywhere, in India, in China, in Africa, in Europe and the US, in South America. Engineers and programmers and people with knowledge. And history is right there. Now, true, if the internet just disappeared, but people could build servers, their backups, the probability of it just all being gone, really wiped out, and the knowledge disappearing strikes me as so low. It's so small that I just don't see it happening. So yes, bad things are going to happen. We might have stagnation, or we might decline economically, and all kinds of bad things will happen. But I don't see a Dark Ages in our future. I don't see that real total destruction, short of a nuclear war that really wipes out civilization. But I don't see that really where that would come from. Right? So never say never, but why not? Let's say never. Right? So if you take out kind of a Dark Ages scenario, and for a long time in objectivism, there was this perspective of the Dark Ages, and I think there still is among many people. I remember in the 80s, I think it was Leonard and Harry, and I can't remember who told the story, but the story was they were walking in New York and it was raining, and they took out an umbrella and opened it up, and I think one of them turned to the other, probably Leonard to Harry, knowing this, said, you know, we should really be thankful we have an umbrella, because when the Dark Ages come soon, even an umbrella will be. And I get why they had that attitude, and I get that that's a lot of people still do, but I don't see it. There's so much wealth being built up, and there's so much knowledge, and it's so dispersed. It's not concentrated anymore. It's not one culture, and it's not one elite. That I just don't see it going away. And again, there are going to be challenges. There's going to be decline. There's going to be struggles. But as long as we have that knowledge, and including in that knowledge, of course, is Ayn Rand and the idea of a real enlightenment, a real renaissance of crucial ideas, there's always that ability to rise up. There's always that ability to improve. It's much more likely to be this pendulum that unfortunately, doesn't go all the way because we're not dominant enough in ideas, so things get worse and worse, and then we get somebody who's a little better and he pushes it back, and the economy starts growing again, and then we go backwards. Or we might get a prolonged just stagnation, which I think we might. But even then, technology advances, and as I said, economists don't know how to measure the quality of life improvements of technology. So you could measure stagnation, and yet I'll stand, like for example, Japan has gone through stagnation. Nothing economically, zero economic growth for what? Since 1991, I think, or 89, something like that, right? It's a long time. And yet, in many respects, the quality of life has gone up significantly because of technology, because they have the technology, and they can afford the technology, and they buy the technology, and they live the technology. So even though it doesn't show up in the numbers, the quality of life has gone up moderately. So the real loss is what we could have had and don't have. The real loss is how good things could be if we were truly free and the world was dominated by rational people, filled with pride and self-esteem in what they did, and how rich and how prosperous and how successful and how much fun that would be. That's the loss. And of course, the individual victims of the system today are the other loss. But I think just getting that perspective of things are just not going to go away. They're just not going to collapse. They're just not going to disappear. I just don't see that happening. I think gives us much more confidence in terms of how we deal with the future and what objectivism has to do, because it means we have time. And I do think we have time. And that doesn't mean, so I was thinking about this talk, do I disagree with Leonard Peikoff about the dim hypothesis? And no, I think America could be a dictatorship in 40 years. But I don't think that's the end of the world. It might be the end of America, or it might be the end of America for a while until we rebel against that dictatorship and replace them, right? But you have to have this global perspective of it's not the end of the world. So America will be a dictatorship. I mean, that's horrible. But it doesn't stop us. It doesn't stop the ideas. And again, there's so many foreigners here at this conference. There's so much energy outside the United States around the ideas of objectivism that we're not as dependent in the United States and on America and American objectivists for knowledge and information and everything else, right? And I think it's going to be hard for a dictator in an internet age to sustain themselves and be successful and maintain a dictatorship for very long. There'll be a rebellion against it, and that won't be pleasant. And who knows what will come out of the rebellion? But the point is, it's not all downhill, and certainly not, I don't think, on a global scale. Now, again, some maniac could, push a button, and everything I just said becomes meaningless because a nuke would change everything. But I also think, people talk about the Islamic threat, right? So people say, what about if Iran gets a nuclear weapons? That's the worst case scenario I can think in terms of an Islamic threat. We can talk about migration to Europe, but in terms of an existential threat, right? Iran gets a nuke, right? So, okay, so they got a nuke. Now they have to put it onto a ballistic missile, right? And the ballistic missile actually has to be able to hit a target and not just fall into the ocean or into the Mediterranean Sea or whatever. I don't hold high probabilities that either one of those happens. Then you have to assume the mullahs, now they're suicidal, but it's interesting how these suicidal maniacs function, right? They usually send the little guys, poor guys, to do the dying for them. You know, you didn't see Osama bin Laden strap on a suicide belt and go and do, he was hiding. He didn't go out there fighting Americans. He was hiding in some shack. So does Khamenei, the leader, is he really out for 72 virgins? Or is he kind of has a, you know, kind of okay with the life he has? Is he really passionate about really wanting to die for the cause? You know, I'm skeptical, right? I don't think it's good that Iran gets a bomb, but I'm just saying let's put it in the right proportion and let's think about what the probability to actually use it and actually something would happen. I think it's small because if they launch, they're wiped out. Israel would not. That's one thing I don't think the Israelis would sit back on. So, but even if they did launch, what's the probability you would hit the target? Low. What's the probability Israel couldn't shoot it out of the air? I think the probability is very high that Israel could shoot it out of the air. I just think if you take all those probabilities, what is the probability that actually Israel gets wiped out by a nuclear bomb, never mind America? I think it's very, very, very low, even if the Iranians get a bomb. So it would be horrible because it changes the geopolitics and it's a mess and, you know, it's a bad thing. And even a tiny probability of something that awful is terrible. But, you know, again, in the context of living one's life, I'm not going to lose sleep over it. I don't think any of you should. And the same is true of, you know, the Islamization of Europe, right? By the way, the more violent the Muslims in Europe become, the less probability there will be for them to take over Europe. Because every time they're violent, the Europeans wake up and say, oh no, we don't want you, and they kick them out, right? Or they put up fences, or they get aggressive. But the other thing is what I said, they're too stupid to be successful, particularly with violence. You know, so I'm watching this, I don't know if I'm watching this mini-series on TV. It's very depressing. So it's called Looming Towers, the Looming Towers. So it's the run-up to 9/11 from the perspective of American intelligence. So it's the FBI and the CIA and everything that happens leading up to 9/11. And so the Cole, you remember the Cole, the ship off of Yemen that got blown up, and the embassies in Tanzania and Kenya and Tanzania got blown up, that hundreds of people died. And it follows those and basically the FBI and the CIA trying to figure out how to handle this. And it's based on a book that was written about this. And it has a political angle, which tends to be somewhat on the left. But so it particularly makes the Bush administration look stupid, but they were. And it particularly makes, but Clinton doesn't come off unscathed either. Basically claiming that he was too busy with Monica to really focus on bin Laden. But what comes across in the series is, and I think this is true, that if the intelligence agencies would talk to each other, if they had just been slightly more rational, slightly more actually concerned with the security of American citizens instead of the politics between them, this is primarily the FBI and the CIA, then 9/11 would have been averted. They were this close to preventing it. They knew, for example, that this one guy who was associated with Al-Qaeda had come into the United States, and the CIA did not share that information with the FBI. So nobody monitored him. And according to the series, they outsourced the monitoring of him to the Saudis, who then lost him. And you know, he disappeared for them. And he was one of the guys. And then they knew there was a problem in flight schools, but they never really followed it up. And they never really did the due diligence, partially because the CIA and the FBI didn't like talking to each other. But the most sophisticated plan that Al-Qaeda has ever put together, we came this close to catching them. These things are really, really hard to put on when you have good intelligence services, and ours are mediocre. And they're probably better today because a lot of that barriers were fixed. A lot of the communication problems were fixed. We'll see. We'll probably deteriorate again into complacency. And I think in Europe, you know, you see these attacks and you see long periods of no attacks. And I think a lot of that is just intelligence. A lot of that is just monitoring the right people and listening to the right people and getting the right people, right? While they're listening to all of us at the same time, but that's a separate issue, right? So it doesn't take much to stop the violence. I think the much bigger threat in Europe is just that the Muslims have kids, and the Europeans don't. We know Europeans don't have kids, and that just population-wise, they just start dominating, and culturally they're more confident, and therefore the Europeans maybe even start converting to Islam, and that's this book that came out, Submission. There was a very powerful book. I kind of recommend it, but not very well written, but a powerful book, where the Europeans basically submit, right? They submit. But really, is that going to happen? I mean, let's really think about it. First of all, even though Europeans are not demanding the Muslims assimilate, some of them do. Not all of them, and maybe not even a majority, but some of them do. Some of the young Muslims in Europe are pretty cool, hip. They're not, they become programmers. They go work in the city of London. They do all kinds of stuff. Now, maybe it's a minority, but okay, so if you run the numbers, just the demographic numbers, a certain percentage of Muslims in Europe are not going to have lots of kids because they'll achieve middle classhood, and middle class people just don't have lots of kids. A lot of them will become secular because, you know what? Secular is true and religion is false, and many of them will discover the truth and abandon their religion. Not all of them, maybe just a minority. But again, it reduces their numbers and it reduces their ability to grow to the points of taking over, right? And who knows, some of them, it might be a much larger number than we expect will become more secular. I remember being in a cab in, I think it was Copenhagen, either Copenhagen or Amsterdam, I think it was Copenhagen. And I don't know, it was one of these times where on my podcast, I was arguing with the people who think Muslims are the threat to Western civilization. Everything's going to be wiped out, and they're the bad guys, and we should kick them all out of the United States. And I get into an Uber, and the Uber had to do a whole thing so that the taxi drivers wouldn't see him, because in Copenhagen they were beating them up and slashing their tires. The taxi drivers were doing that to the Uber drivers. So now they banned Uber in Copenhagen, which is the solution to these things, right? Instead of penalizing the taxi drivers. So the Uber drivers, I get in the Uber driver and we start chatting, and the Uber drivers was born in Afghanistan. He moved to Denmark as a kid and was bitterly complaining about Europe because it wasn't free enough. It wasn't capitalist enough. And he said, all I want to do is get to America. I want to have my own business. I want to achieve. I want to succeed. I want to be left alone. And I said, I wish I could give you the visa right now. Right? And he's a Muslim background from Afghanistan. His parents, I'm sure, were observant, but he was having none of it. Didn't care about religion. Didn't care about. He just wanted to have a good life. And I'm not saying that's a majority. I'm not even saying that's a large number. I don't know. I don't think people have really done the research, because it's so easy, again, to focus on the terror, to focus on what's scary, to focus on those neighborhoods where they're dominating, and not to look at the long-term trends, and not to look at the fringes where they're assimilating, or where they're, because that's not interesting, right? You go write a book about Europe's fine. Nobody's going to buy it, right? It's like what I say about climate change. If you're a researcher and you do a bunch of research, and your conclusion at the end of the research is, life's good, everything's fine. Can I get more money? Nobody's going to give you any money, right? But if you're a researcher and your conclusion is, life on Earth will end soon, I think. I'm not 100%, but I think something really bad's going to happen. Those plastic straws are going to kill us all. I mentioned in my talk that Seattle is banning plastic straws. But I need more money to dig deeper and figure this out more. Oh, of course we'll give you money to that, right? Because civilization is at stake. The world is going to end. And to me, that's a lot of what the climate change scientists do, is they can't afford to find that everything's okay, because the money is going to dry up. And it creates a certain, and then they don't want to believe that they're lying, to get money, so they convince themselves of their findings. And with statistics, let me tell you, as somebody who's done stats, who's done econometrics, it's easy to lie to yourself. It's very easy. I'm taking this outlier out, and I'm going to leave this outlier in and you make a rationalization. And then the graph looks perfect. The regression analysis is beautiful. Right? So even when it comes to Islam and the threat of Europe, which looks pretty bleak, and it is pretty bleak, is it? Do we really have all the facts? Do we know? Is there a way of looking at it where maybe it's not as bad as people think? I don't know. I mean, somebody would have to research it. You'd have to get the facts. You'd have to look at it. But I'm suspicious of the knee-jerk reaction. I'm suspicious of people who go and interview just the radicals or just in the really bad neighborhoods or look at just some of the statistics and not look at the whole universe of what's actually going on. Or people who take demographics and just extrapolate. They did this in Israel. And in Israel, they did the demographics. This is about 10, 15 years ago. And they did the demographics on Arab birth rates, Jewish birth rates, religious Jews versus secular Jews. And the conclusion was, in 20 to 40 years, secular Jews are wiped out because religious Jews and Arabs are having all the babies. And there's basically no secular Jews. The secular Jews are just a minority in the country, and either it becomes a Palestinian state just by default because there's so many Arabs, or the ultra-Orthodox Jews take it over, and it's almost worse, right? I'm serious. Have you ever sat next to one of these on the plane? I mean, that's whenever I fly to Israel, one of my nightmares, particularly if by accident I'm a coach or something, is to be surrounded by ultra-Orthodox Jews. We were on a flight from Nice to Tel Aviv in the middle of the night, and I literally told my wife, I just hope they're not on this flight. Luckily, they weren't. What's that? You have to fly on Saturdays, and then they won't be on. That's right. The scary thing. This was on Thursday night. And the flight was going to make it in very early Friday morning, and it was just before some holiday. So I thought they were all going to fly back to be in the Holy Land for the weekend and but luckily there was only one on the plane. I counted them. That's how anxious I was. But this was the story, right? And I bought into that. Yeah, wow, this is. And I remember saying in Q&As and stuff, the real problem in Israel's birth rates and demographics, and I don't see how Israel could exist in 40 years. Well, it turns out none of that played out. So what's happening in Israel is birth rates among Arabs has plummeted. Because they're getting, particularly in Israel itself, they're getting richer. They're middle class. They're not having 8, 9, 10 kids. They're having 2. Because Arabs behave once they reach a certain level of wealth, and they're fairly secular within Israel, they stop having multiple huge. Even the Palestinians having very few kids. So the population among the Palestinians in the West Bank, I don't know about Gaza, but in the West Bank and within Israel is stabilizing, and it's growing slightly. And secular Jews in America are having kids like they're rabbits or something. I mean, the number of Israel now has the highest among secular Jews, has the highest birth rate in the West. It's higher than any Catholic country. Catholic countries have the lowest, right? So they're either not having sex or they're cheating because they're using birth control, right? They're not supposed to. They're not supposed to do it. So Israel's birth rate among secular Jews is skyrocketing. And the reason is that Israel's doing well. People, I think children is partially, I mean, there are lots of reasons why people don't have children. One of them is, particularly when you look at a culture-wide phenomena, is optimism about the future. Israel's a relatively, right now, an optimistic culture. It's growing, there's wealth creation, people are energized, excited, motivated, and they have 3 kids as compared to 1 point something that we have in the United States, right? And Europe has 1.2 or even less than 1 in some cultures. It's truly shrinking. Except Switzerland. And again, which I think is the reason is the optimism. And I'm curious what's going to happen to Ireland, because, if you want to model, if you're like looking at Europe and you want to model for kind of the best country, there's competition only between, so forget Sweden. I don't know why anybody worries about Sweden. Sweden's like poor, or Denmark or Norway. Why would you even bother with them, right? If you want to model for what a European country can be, it's either Switzerland or Ireland. Ireland's actually richer than Switzerland on a per capita GDP basis right now. And it has maybe a freer economy. It's ranked very high on the economic freedom index, not quite as high as Switzerland, just under Switzerland, but it's richer. Per capita GDP is very high in Ireland. Taxes are very low. Regulations are relatively low, and they're getting over their Catholicism, as the pro-abortion referendum in Ireland just showed, right? So if you were looking for a model, those are the two countries in Europe you want to focus on. Not this, Sweden's like would be the 40th richest country, state, if it was a state in the United States. It's, put aside that it's cold, it's just not that interesting. So, yeah, so these demographic issues, you have to look at the trends, and you have to really dig in the numbers, and you can't make assumptions of extrapolating birth rates today into the future. There was an op-ed in the Washington Post that I talked about on a show a few weeks ago that extrapolated birth rates in Africa into the future and said, oh my God, there are going to be billions and billions and billions of people in Africa, and they're all going to starve. But again, Africa, in spite of everything, Africa's becoming a little richer, a little bit more middle class. Some countries are actually doing very well. Some of the fastest growing economies in the world today are in Africa because they're adopting property rights. They're adopting elements of capitalism. What's that? Botswana's doing very well. Rwanda, remember where this genocide happened? Rwanda's doing very well. Namibia is doing very well. So there are countries in that area that are doing well because they're adopting property rights, they're adopting the right kind of principles, and what's going to happen as they do well? Well, you're already seeing it. Birth rates drop. If all your kids survive, you don't have to have 10. I mean, we have 10 when we assume half of them are going to die. And we have 10 when we need them to work in the fields so that to feed us. When we have 10 when we can't save money for the future and we need our kids to support us when we're old, and we think half of them, are not going to want to because they hate us, and half of, so there's a greater probability somebody will support you when you're old if you have more kids, right? But if you can save, then you don't need your kids to support you anymore. You can piss them off right from the beginning, and you don't have to worry about it. Right? So, so the whole dynamic, people just project these things out, and they don't think. They're not objective. They're not realistic about it. It's not about being, again, biased. It's just about being objective about what's really going on in the world. So, yeah, so I'd become more optimistic with age, which usually works the other way around, I think. Because and a lot of it has to do with this traveling around the world and seeing the energy and excitement that young people have about ideas of freedom, seeing the development in countries that I never thought would. I mean, a story in China is real, and every time I go to China, I'm blown away again. And people still tell me it's a bubble, and they're still telling, really? Have you been there? You can't have. I mean, I'm not saying there's no bubbly stuff. I'm not saying there's no bad stuff in China, even economically. And they might not go into recession. They certainly do for one at some point. But they have created massive amounts of wealth, even if some of it is froth, right? Real wealth. And there's real education, and there's real excitement. I just hired a kid in Puerto Rico. I just hired somebody from a hedge fund who was born in China, came to the U.S., got a PhD in biology and data analysis at Duke University, unbelievably smart. I don't know why he's in Puerto Rico, but good for me because because I was it, so I could hire him. And he's brilliant, and he's great, and he's smart, and he's productive, and he's doing stuff. So even if they're not in China, the very fact that China opened up and they can leave China gives us enormous resources here, if we allow immigrants in, which is a big if, I guess. But if they don't come here, they'll go to Canada, or they'll go to Europe, or they'll go places that do allow them in, right? And they'll still be productive and create and build and make stuff. So, that's one of the things, just as a side thing, one of the things that really pisses me off about the immigration debate is this assumption that if we had free immigration, only poor people would come, only ignorant people would come, only the really, the violent people would come, whatever the assumptions people have. But you know who would come mostly? Are the best people. Like think if you're a computer scientist in Sweden, right? I don't know, Switzerland, wherever, right? And right now, you're doing well where you are. You'd love to come to the US, but it's a hassle. Oh my God. It's the visa requirements, the being here requirement. It's just not worth it, right? So you stay in Sweden and you do your job and life is okay. But it could be better if you came to the United States, but it's just not worth the hurdle. And you're certainly not going to come illegally because it's just not worth it because life is pretty good where you are. Imagine if it was easy to come. All the best minds in the world would come. I mean, who doesn't want, if you're in technology, to be in Silicon Valley or in Austin, Texas, where the exciting stuff is happening? You don't want to be in Stockholm. And it's cold. I keep saying that. I live in Puerto Rico, remember. So if you drop the limitations on immigration, you would actually get the best people in the world coming first and foremost. Yes, you'd get a lot of poor people to pick strawberries and stuff, which we need as well. But you'd get the best, and they would create massive economic value and jobs and just be great people to have in our society. And people ignore that completely. I mean, the number of Silicon Valley startups that are founded by immigrants it's over 50%. I mean, if you look at it, and the number of CEOs at the unicorns is again about 50% who are foreigners. So the CEO of Microsoft, for example, Steve Jobs, whose father was a Syrian. You can't have Syrians, right? No matter who they are as individuals, you just can't have them. But here's the father of Steve Jobs. If he'd had that ban, he would have never come in. So this attitude driven by fear rather than by facts, rather than by reality, rather than by examining what's really going on. What is the experience of Muslims in America? Do they assimilate or don't they assimilate? How violent are they? Yes, there might be a small community of pretty violent, nasty people from Somalia in Minneapolis, all right? But is that true of all Muslims? Is that true of just Somalis? Is there a reason why? And what about all those nasty Italians who came here and started the mafia? All those Sicilians who came here. I mean, God, we brought in the worst Italians possible. Right? But okay, a generation or two passed and not to mention the Jewish mafia. No, real. I mean, a lot of the worst murderers during the mafia's heyday were Jews. Right? So we should have never let the Jews in, but then we would have missed out on some quite productive people. Right? And this, yeah, we got a question here in the audience.
Yaron, I've heard you talk a lot about the importance of education, and I've spent the last 19 years as a public school educator, and I finally threw in the towel just a couple of weeks ago, and I'm moving on. But with optimism as sort of the theme here, it's really hard for me to think of an optimistic scenario for American public education. So I'm going to challenge you to come up with one and share it with me.
Okay, so the question is, can I come up with an optimistic scenario for American public education? And the answer is, I'd say two optimistic things. It's really hard at the end of the day to destroy a human mind. I went to public schools. I told the story in my thing of going to a public school in Brookline, Massachusetts, where the year I was there were no walls. We sat on beanbags. We didn't really study anything. I spent 1 year in that school and fell behind my school in Israel by at least 1 year, right? I basically gained nothing, right? The kids around me were ignorant. You knew nothing, and the teachers did nothing to educate them further. I bet you most of those kids went on to be lawyers and doctors and accountants, and because it's hard to destroy. It's hard to destroy the human mind. Again, I don't want to be overly. Some minds were destroyed. Some minds are destroyed. I think particularly in the inner cities, particularly where the schools are really, really awful and where they don't have support from parents and they don't have access maybe to technology, which can help enhance the minds. But so I think that's one that particularly today, where there's access to computers, there's access to information, there's access to other stimulating factors. There's a lot of additional means to educate yourself or for your parents to educate you if they want, above and beyond what the public schools do, that, you know, it's hard to be optimistic in that sense because it's terrible that needs to be done. But if we just kind of extrapolated public schools, they're really, really bad. Okay, so all these kids that we meet today should be just idiots and complete incompetence, and they're not, right? Some of them are, maybe a lot more than should be, but most of them are pretty much the same as kids 20 years ago and 40 years ago, and the ones who are ambitious are just as good, and the same thing kids coming out of college, if you look at what they study. Even those kids who go and study English, some of them come out okay. And you think, how did they do that? The English professors are so evil. You know, because that's where postmodernism is strongest, is in the English department. Postmodernism is not even taken seriously in philosophy. It's really a phenomena of English and some of the other humanities. So I'd say one is, it's hard to really destroy them. I think what the schools do is they expose them to math, they expose them to some science. A lot of kids respond to that, whether the teachers are good or not good, kids respond to it, right? So that's one, right? The other thing is that that I think there's already a backlash against public education and against the bad quality of public education, whether that is the charter school movement, which is far from perfect and is a moderate, you know, compromising solution, but better than the alternative, better than not having any choices. The voucher programs, which again, I'm not a huge supporter of, but better than just having public schools without anything. And when I go in front of audiences and I say privatized education, they go, oh my God, you can't say that. But then I explain it a little bit, like a paragraph. They go, okay, yeah, that's not that bad. It doesn't take much, right? I tell them about, you know, I ask them the question of what they would prefer, sending